Hello and welcome to ChooseFI. Today on the show, we have a fun one. We have our good friend Frank Vasquez, who you know from the podcast Risk Parity Radio. And he's actually been on the show twice. In one of our most popular episodes was episode 194, which was the role of bonds in a portfolio. And then he was back again in episode 313. And it is not hyperbole to say that Frank is the single most helpful and valuable member of the entire ChooseFI community. When you go to the Facebook group and you see a question, almost invariably, there is an answer from Frank. And I went and looked. He has made over 17,000 comments in the ChooseFI Facebook group, which is just truly extraordinary. And I don't think I've ever publicly thanked him, so I'm doing that now. Frank is really, he's a treasure. He's so important to our community. And you're really going to enjoy this episode. It's going to be a free-ranging conversation. We're going to do a little mailbag. I'm going to ask Frank some questions that I've always wanted to ask him, and this is going to be a good one. So with that, welcome to ChooseFI.
Sounds like I need to get a life.
Yeah. Oh, we're definitely keeping that one in. Frank. I was going to say, how on earth? So this is what I've always wanted to know. Not how do you have the time to do that, but I mean, your background, you were a lawyer, a career lawyer. You were a partner in a major law firm. It looks like from your LinkedIn, you're an adjunct professor at law schools, including Georgetown. But yet you have become, quite literally a worldwide personal finance expert. How did that happen? Like, where did this passion come from?
I have a lot of curiosities. One of my stories is I am a curious child. And one of the things I'm curious about are economics and personal finance. I have a degree in economics, in addition to a degree in engineering and one in law. And so whenever I see these topics, I tend to drill down on them and have read a lot of things that are historical, and I'm very interested in the whole topic and the development of the topic. So it comes naturally to me.
Okay.
As sort of, I will go and research these things just to know them. If somebody says they're a curious child, I enjoy knowing things and finding things out just to know them for myself without having any other purpose to them.
And I'm assuming that extends far beyond personal finance based on what I know about you.
Yeah, generally. But this is a personality type. If you're familiar with, you probably are not familiar with the idea of narrative psychology.
No.
Which is the idea that we are captured by our stories or our stories animate us. And there's a nice Big Think video about narrative psychology that features Jane Goodall and Terry Crews, the football player who became the actor.
Yeah, of course.
And they talk about their stories. And one of Jane Goodall's stories is as the curious child. In her case, when she was like 3 or 4, she wanted to know how eggs came out of chickens. And so she crawled into a hen house and sat there for 3 or 4 hours watching this chicken. And everybody, of course, was looking all over for her. But she just wanted to know, how does the chicken come out of the egg? And so that is the kind of person I am, that I like to know things just to know them once I see something that I get curious about. And finance is one of those things. It did also play into my legal career in that a lot of what I spent my legal career doing is cross-examining experts, financial experts. So I learned principles of valuation, all kinds of principles like discounted cash flow analysis, how to analyze a business, how to value a gold mine, things about the Argentine currency crisis. I cross-examined Nouriel Roubini, if you know who that is.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time with financial and technical experts, and a lot of times going into this at a deep academic level. And that is the level I will go into a topic when I'm interested in it, is actually going to read academic papers. And whatever summary material is presented in front of me, I'm always, well, where did that come from? And why don't I go read that? And then why don't I go read the next thing?
Okay.
Until I feel like I understand it from both what the state of whatever the topic is, but also the history of it. Where did it come from? Why do we have these ideas? Those sorts of things always interest me. And that's why a lot of times when somebody asks a question, it's kind of this, oh, I'll just pull that off the shelf. opened to page 86.
Okay. Interesting. Isn't it fascinating how our brains work? I think I'm probably like the exact opposite. I'm like the satisficer to the maximizer satisficer. And I feel like that also carries over to like intellectual pursuits. Is like, and this is not something I'm necessarily proud of, but I feel like not like a mile wide, inch deep, but I'm like 6 miles wide, an inch or a couple inches deep. Like I feel like I know a little bit about a lot of things, but like I never, maybe never might be a little extreme, but I very rarely have the intellectual curiosity to like dive to, like you were saying, the absolute genesis of something. And I wonder how much of that has to do with that satisficer. It's similar to investing. Like once I learned about index funds, once I read Simple Path to Wealth, I was like, okay, I'm good. I can just wrap up
Yeah,
shop.
that's enough of that. And for me, that was like the top level. It's like,
Right,
where did
right.
that come from? Why do we even have funds?
Yeah.
Why do we have stocks?
Why did they pick
What's the history
this
of
type
that?
of weighting and not that type of weighting?
Why are we cap weighting these things
Yeah.
instead of organizing them in some other way? All those sorts of questions.
So, okay, I do want to drill down on what your media consumption looks like, because I think this is actually really important because a lot of people ideally want to stay up on things. And there has to be, at least I assume, you can't go 10 miles deep on everything, right? It's just not possible. So there has to be some kind of top of the funnel, I'm assuming, for your media or book reading or whatever consumption. Like, how do you conceptualize that? I guess let's start there.
Well, part of it is what you don't consume. Most of it's
Mm,
what you don't consume. I don't watch TV. I've never seen more than clips of Game of Thrones, for
okay.
example. So there's a lot of things that I just don't participate in. I do, what I love about podcasts and listening to podcasts is that's like a radio in the background of my life all day long. And I subscribe to too many of them. So every morning I
You and
wake
me
up, it's like,
both.
oh, what can I listen to today? And there's 20 or 30 of them in there. And I, sort of pick, well, these topics look interesting or these people look interesting. And I just let it go. I have only a couple of them that are news, and it's usually The Economist and BBC
Okay.
would be those. And I'm not even going to listen to all of those, but those give you the quick highlights of the whole world, and that's enough. Other than that, it kind of seeps into you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't avoid things like that these days. So, I'll spend a lot of time in like the ChooseFI group and a couple other groups on Facebook, but I don't use TikTok. I don't use Twitter anymore. I tried it, stopped doing that,
Yeah.
and a few other things like that. But these days, because the podcast world is so rich with all kinds of information and things, I can get most of what I am interested in from there. And then I'll watch YouTube videos for entertainment, but oftentimes they're not fine. They're like history. They're
Okay.
like geography. There's a guy called the Geography King who I really love. He's really nerdy and he's traveled all of the United States.
Nice.
And so he tells you stuff about these states, or if you go here and here's a really interesting state park you probably haven't heard of. Those sorts of things I'm very curious about. It is sort of a lot of different sources or possibilities every day. And then I just pick something up and look at it. I used to read a lot more on a Kindle. These days, because of what I see or hear about in terms of new books seems derivative or just more of the same, I will look for a summary of it. Or frequently these days, because I listen to so many podcasts, if an author is out and has a new book, they'll do it like a tour. So I will hear like 6 interviews of the same person about the same book. And after I've heard 6 interviews of the same person about the same book, I don't feel like I need to go actually read it.
Agreed. That's a good life hack, actually. If you want to read more books, just listen to podcasts that have authors on. I know Paula Pant on Afford Anything has authors on all the time, and she does a marvelous job.
That's one of the ones I'll pick up, authors on. I think like one of the more recent ones that I probably will read, but I haven't read is Arthur Brooks's recent book. It's a Living Your Best Life or something like that.
Yep.
Co-authored with Oprah Winfrey, because I had read Strength to Strength before that.
Right. Yeah, that one's called Build the Life You Want, The Ardent Science of Getting Happier.
Yeah. And he is really good about sort of taking ancient wisdom and bringing it all forward, because he studied both Eastern and Western philosophy and has this interesting Phi adjacent life where he started as a professional musician.
Yes. It's like a French horn player or some such, right?
French horn player. did that for 10 or 12 or 15 years. And then he went completely differently and went into, he ended up running a think tank of like economic policy, like American Enterprise Institute or something like that. He did that for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. And then he went and became this professor at Harvard studying happiness and human thriving and those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's amazing. 3-act play right there, right?
Yeah. And I do think that's a really good model for life, particularly if you're going to be an early retiree, that, what are all the chapters of life that you want to live? And this is a broader view of the concept in Die with Zero. It's the same concept, but in Die with Zero, they're only talking about, spending your resources, your money.
Sure.
But that concept in a more broader sense also applies to, what else are you spending your time doing or learning? Or, maybe this is the time of your life where you're doing lots of traveling. And maybe this is the time of life where you're doing lots of reading. And maybe you have another chapter in life where you're going to be writing a book or something. But you don't need to be doing the same thing for your whole life or focusing on the same thing for your whole life. And if you think about that as having sort of these multiple chapters in one life, I think this sort of gives a broader perspective and a broader set of possibilities for this human thriving, if you will.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm curious, Frank, how you think about the seasons of your life, right? So you left your law career, or certainly left the firm.
Well, I tried. I'm still.
Yeah, that's why I pulled that back a little bit.
Getting drawn back into it. Last year, I felt like I was working full time again. I had 2 arbitration hearings.
Oh, man.
Doing all sorts of stuff. I, argued in front of the DC Circuit in February, and one of our hearings was at the World Bank, and so it was very interesting.
Wow.
Always those sorts of things. But I interrupted you.
No. Don't be silly. That's important because, maybe you don't have 2 feet in the next chapter, but you're certainly there to some degree. And I think I see you as a teacher. That's how when I think of Frank, I think of you're a teacher. I see that on your podcast, which again is Risk Parity, Parity, Risk Parity Radio. And I see that in the Facebook group. And does that land with you? Have you thought of yourself as a teacher throughout parts of your life?
I have been.
Well, no, I know. I did mention that before. But is that...
I've actually been a teacher for over 25 years now.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know it was that long. Thank goodness.
And, I did things like I was a Boy Scout leader. So that involves a lot of teaching. Yeah, I do find that very valuable. I think it's much easier if you're more of an informal teacher because you get to teach people that are actually interested and want to learn. I feel a lot of sympathy for actual teachers who have classes of people that may or may not be interested in what they have to say. But where that comes from is me being this curious child person who wants to know everything and learn everything. So I had this kind of store of information floating around in my head. And then when something comes up and sort of like, well, okay, now I found somebody who's interested in this and wants to hear about it and share with it. Because as a child, I was more like just talking about what I was interested in all the time, but it's probably about astronomy or something like that. What you learn is that people don't necessarily want to hear that if they're not interested in it. And so what you learn is the better way to do this. Well, just keep that and then wait until someone appears and then you can be the teacher.
Right. And in this case, you have 109,000 people that have self-selected into the ChooseFI Facebook group that are, oh, wow, there are some people who are pretty interested.
What's nice about groups and things like this, it's like, okay, well, here's the people that actually are interested in this topic and want to hear about it. And then you get to share what you know. And they go, oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to know. And it's like, I knew I learned that for some reason other than just I thought it was interesting at the time. So it's kind of a positive feedback loop, if you will. And then you learn things. My audience in particular is pretty sophisticated in terms of wanting to know things to the nth degree. And they frequently will send me emails and saying, have you seen this? Check this out. And we have another topic to discuss or an expansion of a topic that will come up. And so I get to learn that and then add to that what I already know about that topic. And it becomes more of a teaching experience there. But yeah, I do enjoy sharing what I want to know. But what I've learned is you want to save that and share it for the people who are really interested in that, because it's, Never try to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig.
Oh, that's amazing. Sounds right.
When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. I
Yeah.
just pop
No,
in.
that's wonderful. I love that. And the reason why I'm drilling down on this is obviously a lot of us are on the cusp of that next chapter in our lives, or maybe FI is not that far away, or maybe we just got there and we have all these passions. We have these things we're interested in, these things we're learning about, and we want to talk to people about them. So how do you go about that? Well, yeah, there are lots of these little micro communities on the internet that you can really find essentially everything at this point.
Yeah, you can. And what's nice about the podcasting world is you can actually find somebody who's talking about that and find them relatively quickly, go listen to a couple of their podcasts or something, and then interact with them wherever they happen to be, which I think is actually a lot more effective and efficient than it used to be when we were back in the blog era.
Agreed.
It was sort of like somebody would have a blog and then they would have sort of a discussion group attached to the blog or some kind of bulletin board.
Yep.
And that was fine, but it just turns into a bunch of silos. Whereas if there's more of a forum like you ended up creating in Facebook, the ChooseFI group, where people just kind of, oh, FI.
Right.
I heard about that. Let me go see what's here. It was like, well, here's a big group full of these people. And since you have so many different people contributing different things and organizing different events in different places, it has sort of grown beyond what you guys were just doing into lots of other things.
Grown far beyond anything we ever anticipated in every way.
Yeah, but then in
remarkable.
terms of, so what do you do with yourself when you become FI? I go to this idea that it's really stories that drive us. And that's one of the big mental models. And this actually, you see it in different places, which is very interesting. I'm always looking for the cross section of different ideas that come to the same conclusion. Have you read like Yuval Harari's Sapiens?
I certainly have read portions of it. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So his theme of that book is that human beings are the animals that tell stories. So what does that tell you about human beings? What they care about is stories. Where does purpose and meaning come from in your life? It comes from you knowing and living some kind of story that you've told yourself about yourself.
Interesting.
The most common story in Western society is the hero's journey, which the FI journey is a hero's journey, where you start not knowing, and then you learn some things, you find some mentors, you climb some mountains, you do some stuff. Eventually you reach some kind of level of success. And then maybe after that, you share it with other people and things like that. But that's not the only story that you can possibly tell. And I think sometimes people miss that. So I have 3 stories now that kind of animate me.
Okay.
One is this curious child story, which is sort of what is ingrained in me. And that is, people who just find some topic and they just want to know everything about it and go off and get satisfaction just by themselves knowing things. So they're fine by themselves researching and looking at stuff. And then when you get to share it, it's great. Another story that is important to me, and it's also important to my wife, is that of the starfish thrower, which is the parable of the starfish thrower. Is a girl is walking on a beach and she sees all these starfish that have been washed up, and she starts throwing them back one by one to save them. And then, some old grumpy man says something like, wow, what are you wasting your time doing that for? You can't possibly save all those starfish. And her response is, yes, but it mattered to that one.
Yeah.
So a starfish thrower is somebody who it's basically working with one person to save them in some way. So my wife is a court-appointed special advocate, and they actually use this parable as sort of their theme of their organization.
Oh, wow.
What she does is work through the court system and with foster situations where kids get removed from the home and they get foster parents. There's a whole court proceeding as to whether they're going back or what's going to happen to them. But a court-appointed special advocate is sort of the judge's eyes and ears, and is also kind of overseeing and working with these children individually and with other people, because you're there just to help this one person get through. You're not solving the whole world's problems.
Right.
Your satisfaction comes from helping this one person and relating to that one person. That has a lot of meaning to me. You see this occasionally. Movies are mostly hero's journeys. Star Wars is a
Sure.
classic.
That's
Hero has
the one
1,000
jumped to
faces.
mind. Good Will Hunting jumps to mind for Starfish. I don't know.
But if you think about something like It's a Wonderful Life, that's a starfish thrower story.
Okay.
The Christmas Carol is an interesting, that whole accumulating all that money, that's a hero's journey in his mind.
Okay.
To stave away the evils of the world. The epilogue, though, is he becomes a starfish thrower.
Huh.
He goes off and helps Tiny Tim.
Yeah, of course.
So Bob Cratchit's family becomes his starfish. And there's an interesting scene at the end. I like the 1951 movie version of this with Alistair Sim. I mean, he doesn't just like impose himself, but he asks Bob Cratchit, I'd like to help you with that family of yours if you'll let me. And the help is accepted. The relationship is formed. But it's that relationship that is the important thing between you and whomever your starfish is that you are working with. And so I have a number of starfish. I do not like to talk about the ones, at least the ones that are alive.
Okay.
Because I feel like it's going to damage the relationship.
Right. That's a very special bond, obviously. So, okay. So that was the second story. What's the third?
The third story is the Mexican Fisherman. Parable of the Mexican Fisherman is a businessman from New York goes and takes a vacation in Mexico. And as part of his vacation, he goes off on a fishing boat and then is sitting around talking to the fisherman who works there. He asks the Mexican fisherman, well, what do you do all day? It's like, well, I take my boat out, I go fishing in the morning, I catch some fish, and then I'm done working. And in the afternoon, I, hang out at the cantina, play guitar, and just have a good time with my friends and family. And the businessman says, well, wait, look, you could really ramp this up, this fishing operation you got here. You get some other boats, you build this out. This could be worth millions of dollars. It would take a lot of work, but you could really ramp this up. The Mexican fisherman says to him, okay, so suppose I, did all that. The story's much longer than I'm giving you the short version. Then what would I do? And the guy says, well, then you could retire and just, hang out in a little village with your friends and family and maybe, play a musical instrument or
go to the canteen. Unbelievable. I love that one.
Have a great time. And so that is also because what the businessman is describing is another hero's journey. Let's take this little fisherman story and turn it into this, be the biggest fisherman on the planet with the most boats and all this sort of stuff. And that would be great if that was what you were interested in. But if what you are interested in is developing personal relationships and things like that, the hero's journey is actually not a good story for that. It's a good story for the other people who are in that hero's journey with you or on it with you, that you're all doing the same thing. But it's not good for your friends and family who don't care about your fishing operation or other things like that, that you need time doing things that are not profitable or do not seem that relevant all the time. And so there is, I think, a conflict that people run into with careers because we all want our children to go on their hero's journey and be heroes.
Sure.
And that's what we're trained to. Well, no, we want to have agency. We want to, become something and achieve something. And you should do those things. But in the end, that's not all there is. And if you pursue that to the exclusion, that is why people who are working all the time end up getting divorced and are not connected with their other family and friends.
Yeah.
That is also why when you leave work, you suddenly realize you don't have much in common with those people at work that you thought were your best friends.
Right. Because
the reason you all felt together is because you were all on that same hero's journey together. And now you're no longer on that journey with them anymore. Where you get to another mental model here then is you go to the 5 regrets of the dying. Are you familiar with that idea?
Yes, definitely.
A couple of those are related to hero's journey kind of things, being true to myself and that kind of thing. But at least half of them are related to relationship issues, that spent more time with my friends, things like that. Those are not served as well by going on endless hero's journeys, but they're served better by some other kind of story where you are more working with other people or creating an environment where you can have those kind of warm friendships and relationships. So with my podcast, I purposely not made it a hero's journey.
Okay.
I say we have no sponsors, we have no guests, we have no expansion plans.
Sounds about right.
Because the idea is not to grow it into some big thing that's going to take over the world or be the most important thing, but to find a few people and then have it's a Mexican fisherman story that I'm trying to develop new friendships out of having this podcast. So like I've had visitors who have come through and, they were coming to DC and they brought their family. It's like, well, come over for dinner, or, let's get together and go on a bike ride. Those sorts of things are more important to me in terms of what do I want to get out of this podcast? It isn't to become famous podcaster. The social part of it is the Mexican fisherman part of it. But then it also fulfills this curious child story that I have in my head. And then occasionally I do work with people one-on-one and individuals, which gets to the Starfish thrower part of it. So when I was thinking of what do I want this podcast to be, or what am I trying to do with it, there was an intentional saying, no, this is going to be enough of this kind of development activity or expansion activity, or no, I'm not going to try to get any sponsors. I'm not going to try to make any money off of it at all. In fact, the only financial thing involved with it is I have a charity that I sponsor out of it. And so if you donate money to the charity, you get to go to the front of my email line.
Very cool.
And talking about that because it serves homeless people. And then I have a listener who said, I was a homeless person. So it's really meaningful what you're doing with that. And so a connection gets formed there. But I think this all comes about in sort of really being intentional about, particularly when you're 5 and you're done, it's like, what am I going to do now? Well, what's important to you now? Is it to go and climb another mountain? I mean, maybe you do want to climb another mountain. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with having another hero's journey or doing something like that. But if you've been like me and you've just been working, these 80-hour weeks for years on end and running around all over the world in a high pressure environment, suddenly it's sort of like, well, no, maybe I just want to spend time on relationships, and then my activities, how are they going to foster current relationships or build new relationships? And it's interesting because I feel like something you said on a different podcast sort of played into some of this, because you were talking at one point, and I don't remember what podcast it was on, but you were talking about how in 2019, you and Jonathan had achieved this sort of level of success.
Yes.
In terms of the hero's journey of the ChooseFI podcast. And you got some awards, and sort of was a question of like, what do we do now? Are we going to turn this into Dave Ramsey, Ramsey Enterprises, or do we have enough of that? And when I heard that, I was like, yeah, that is a sort of recalibrating a story, that you've had enough of that kind of a hero's journey, and you're trying to morph it into some other thing that is sustainable in your mind or your thought. And I think another part you always talk about is, wanting to spend more time with your children. I think you take that admonition that 90% of your days with your children are before they're 18. That doesn't have to be true.
That is very true.
I will tell you that, we have 3 grown children. One is just graduating and is following the path of Brad Barrett. Is coming home to live with us, start his first job so he can save some money and then figure out where he's going to go from there. But the other 2 we see frequently. We have great relationships with them. We know their girlfriends and their friends and stuff. Our eldest son and his girlfriend both work for a company called MITRE, which is this weird Sputnik thing that's owned by the federal government, and they do secret stuff in there. But their headquarters is like 3 miles from our house. So whenever they come up for meetings, they both stay here. And sometimes she'll come up by herself and stay with us. And so in some respects, I think you'll find that dealing with your children as adults is even more rewarding than it was when they were children. And you can see much more of them than you might think from that statistic.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, that is like a worst case scenario type thing.
Well, that is how things probably were more like, certainly when I was growing up, it was more, you get pushed out of the nest and you go seek your fame and fortune and
your own hero's journey, right?
Don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Seriously.
That's actually not the way most of the world works, most cultures work.
Yeah.
They're more sort of, no, we have this family and you're here together all the time and you see each other more of the time, and there's a relationship that continues, or other sometimes relationships that are formed. But I just wanted to reassure you, don't get so wound up that that this is it. I got 3 years.
And then it's all over. No, and I fully
mentioned having
anticipate
that clock. I was going, all right, this has gone too far.
So yeah, to catch the audience up, just in case you haven't heard me mention this a couple of times, I've quoted the article from Wait But Why. So it's the website Wait But Why. It's called The Tail End. And yeah, in there, Tim Urban essentially says every year that your child is from 0 to 18 is more or less 5% of all the time you'll ever spend with them. So by the time they graduate high school, you'll be at about 90% of all the time you'll ever spend with them. So I think the moral there is really use that time wisely. And that's, Frank, what I'm trying to get across and what I'm thinking in my own head, as opposed to like this horrible countdown. Like, because I fully anticipate my kids to be part of my life intimately for many, many years after they graduate high school and college. So I'm not worried personally. But that said, you still need to be cognizant of it, right?
Yeah. There's the time you're going to do those things. I had 2 adventures to the Philmont Scout Reservation with one of my sons, where, we went on these 80-mile backpacking trips and things like that. That was going to happen when they were in their teens, and it wasn't going to happen at other times. I spent the better part of a decade videoing our kids doing their sporting events and things like that, and became the commentator for their teams. So that, I didn't know anything about the sport they were actually participating in. So I make a good cheerleader though. That was the time to do that.
Sure.
And I needed to carve out work time. I think we're so much more conscious of this these days, because growing up, the story was, the song Cats in the Cradle by Cat Stevens. When you coming home, Dad? I don't know when, but we'll get together then. And then what happens? His kid grows up, leaves, and then kind of runs the same life. It's like, well, I don't even have time to see you now, Dad, because I'm too busy with the kids and the job and all this sort of stuff. That was a model for a long time and is the basis for a lot of those statistics, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the way things are. I always think of that movie Gran Torino too, when I'm thinking
I never saw that.
This is with Clint Eastwood, plays grumpy old auto worker, get off my lawn. You should see that. Because, the relationship he ends up having with his adult children is his wife dies and they're like, well, you should probably go to a home. And he's like, he's completely, disaffected from his own children and is sort of living this. He had his hero's journey as the auto worker and provider and things like that, but is living this kind of listless life. He actually becomes a starfish thrower for the next door neighbors, the Hamong family, and there's a gang involved and other things. But some of the best scenes is when he's taking this young boy under his wing to like help him get a job and not be hanging out with gangs and stuff like that. And so he like takes him to a barber shop to try to tell him how to talk with guys. And I won't repeat this because there's
not
a lot of curse words
for
involved. But it's a hilarious scene. And then he gets him a job in construction with somebody he knows and takes him to the hardware store and shows him what he needs to buy and things like that.
Yeah.
So that really is a starfish thrower story, and why, as an older person, you do want to have that kind of warm role with people where you can help them and they appreciate it. It goes both ways. You're not just helping people who don't appreciate it. You're finding somebody who wants your help and wants to have the relationship and then working in that relationship.
I love how intentional you've been about that. And it sounds like you've cultivated that with obviously your podcast and your community. And I mean, that's very self-selecting, both on their part and your part. And also, you mentioned in passing, you had relatives come and live with you. I know you've told me about the basement where you've had a couple dozen,
like 20 people live down there at one point.
Yeah, which is absolutely wild. Mostly one at a time, I'm assuming. But,
mostly. We've had a few incidences like, you need to clear out because we got another one coming.
Right. The next starfish is coming through. But I mean, like you said, that is what builds relationships, right? Like being intentional about this stuff. As you're talking about this, I'm thinking about like how and this is not like beat myself up day. It has nothing to do with me, but like where, especially with my own podcast with ChooseFI, it's been a very different type of thing. This is like a one to many. And I think there are often times where I'll go to like an economy conference, like we were just at, and it's wonderful. And believe me, I never lose sight of how amazing it is that like hundreds of people want to talk to me. But that said, I get 1, 2, 3 minutes with each person, and it's just like a little fleeting snippet, right? And there is value there to some degree. And I think some people want to tell me their story, and again, wonderful. But like I'm not diving deep with people, and there is an aspect of missing that, right? But there are always choices in life, and it's interesting to see how you've been so intentional about your choices.
Well, you are the nicest guy of 5, so.
Yeah, you've coined this now. I walked right into that, Frank.
Yeah, one thing about my podcast too is I have a peculiar sense of humor, we shall say, and so it's very amusing to me. I either get 5-star reviews or 1-star reviews.
Interesting.
It's like I must be doing something right then, because that's what I really want is people that really, really want to listen to it, even if there's 5 of them, rather than 1,000 people who can take it or leave it or really don't like it at all.
Yeah,
I mean, there's just the difference there. So have you read that new Arthur Brooks book?
I just got it on ebook. I'm about like 5% of the way through, so I'm not far enough through to even speak intelligently on it.
Yeah, that was one of the ones I actually haven't read it, but I've heard so many interviews of him and summaries of it. I know what it says, and I've known what it says from other things too, because he's collected the Eastern philosophy of we need to reduce our desire because desire is what causes suffering, the whole Buddhist kind of philosophy. He's just trying to meld that with the Western idea, which is more directed at, well, what does that mean in terms of, well, what am I trying to do or not do? And this comes more from, I guess it comes from Aristotle and the Greeks, but it's passed through Thomas Aquinas because the medieval people looked all that stuff up and brought it through. But anyway, you get to what are called the 4 idols, which are money, power, fame, and pleasure seeking. And so all of those things are stuff you want at least some of. You want to have some money, you want to have some power, you want to have some agency in life. You'd like to be famous enough, at least among your friends and family, that people have some knowledge and desire to be around you. And then with the pleasure seeking, that's just, well, you want to have a couple of drinks, not a couple of bottles every day.
Right.
But what is real point there is, and what the point of that is that those things are oftentimes where things go off the rails when you get too sort of addicted, or you start measuring your life by those things. That, no, I need more money. No, I need more power. No, I need more and more fame, which often then leads to the addictions.
Yeah, for sure.
But the point there he was saying, and another thing that I thought was really important, was that you lose your sense of purpose when you start sort of pursuing those things for their own. The meaning of your life is having more money or more power. The way he describes it, which I thought was very interesting, that when you do that, purpose and meaning can devolve into raw ambition, which is actually not something you really want to have. That is the wanting things just as a counter or attaching that is your value in life. And so that those 4 idols become the substitutes for actual real purpose and meaning in life, which I thought was just a very interesting way to think about the whole thing. Because then I meshed that with, you've probably never read Rene Girard, have you?
No, I have not.
So we can talk about mimetic theory for a while. The central idea of that, which I think is very interesting, is that most of our desires are not actually our own, but are copied from other people unconsciously.
Okay. Is this like mimetic desires?
Yes. So the real reason, I mean, that's how marketing works, essentially. It's Cialdini's influence is the same ideas, but presented from a different direction. But I've really taken that to heart. And where I've thought about that is like, if I want something, if I see something that I think I want, that is like, yeah, but do I really want it? Or am I just channeling some other person's desires? I'm very suspicious of my own wants
Mm.
for anything in particular. It helps put a check on just wanting the next toy or the next thing, because I was having, it might have been on the ChooseFI board or somewhere else. I was saying, it's like, yeah, but it's kind of like wearing somebody else's underwear.
Oh, God.
If you think about your desire for a Tesla or some other
Yeah.
object of the day as that, it's sort of like, I better really, really want this for my own reasons, because
Yeah.
otherwise it's a copy desire, which is what sort of leads to conflicts. And it's not all bad. Of course, we're primates, so we copy each other to learn things. But it's when you're actually trying to become somebody else by wearing the same things they wear and
Right.
doing the same things they do and talking the same way they talk. That's what Gerard is talking about, mimetic desire.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, he's one of Peter Thiel's favorite people.
Really? I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but yeah, it's interesting to see, to see fads. I have a middle school daughter, and to see these things come and go, and like Stanley mugs are all the
Yeah.
the rage right now, and it's like, man, where do these trends start? I think back to, what was it, Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point, when he talked about what was it? It wasn't Birkenstocks. It was some kind of clothing
Crocs,
piece.
maybe.
Yeah, it could have been. We'll have to fact check it and whatever. But like, where on earth do these things come from? Like, where did that start? But yet now you have millions of teenage kids who are now craving these crazy Stanley mugs. And it's just, I mean, that is the ultimate example of the
Yeah,
mimetic desire.
it is the normal state of human beings
Yeah.
to copy, not only just copy each other's behaviors, but copy each other's desires, stories, wants, things like that. And it happens unconsciously just by being whatever environment you're in.
Well, the kind of practical takeaway for me is, even though I'm probably in the first percentile in terms of like consumer behavior or consumerists, but I find, almost like you're saying, it's like somebody else's desire. When I find, it almost feels like a fever. Like, oh, I've got to research this. I've got to look at that. Like, and I'm thinking about buying something. And like, almost invariably, I don't actually want that thing. But it again, it feels like there's no other way to describe it other than like a fever has overtaken me.
Yes.
And granted, this doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it can become all consuming. And it's wild to see it happen in your own brain. And now I'm like consciously aware of it, so I can take a step back. But I mean, I've definitely bought a couple things over the last couple of years that I know specifically were because of that fever. And now I'm more cognizant of it, because almost invariably when you get the item, at least in my case, I realized I didn't want the damn thing in the first place. It's just sitting in my closet.
Yeah, I mean, and it's most obvious with items like that. But then, I'm sure this happened also when you were in the professional environment. For me, all the lawyers are kind of buying the same things and consuming the same things and wearing the same
I'm
things.
sure the same cars.
Yeah, the joke is the young lawyers, everybody just buys a BMW. And the guy says, well, no, I'm original. It's like, what do you mean you have a BMW? It's like, well, mine's gray and the other ones are blue. That's about as original as he got.
Good self-awareness, right?
But that is definitely the truth of the way we live. The idea of, well, what will become popular, like you're saying, the Stanley mugs, that is an interesting example of an emergent property. And this is because it's what you would call a complex adaptive system. And most things that we care about are complex adaptive systems, like the weather system, financial markets, anything that is complicated with lots of moving parts and lots of things going on. The issue with that is you can look at the behaviors of the individual parts of it, but not really understand what the outcome is going to be. And that outcome is what you would call an emergent property. And that is sort of how one thing leads to another, how a few people buying Stanley mugs all of a sudden erupts into this one becomes the popular one. There isn't almost any rhyme or reason or any way to predict exactly which one it's going to be. And that's what marketers spend all their time trying to figure out, well, what do I need to do to make this the most popular thing? And it doesn't always work, because it's also what you would call path dependent. That, yeah, it doesn't matter on random factors and who went first and whether, this pop star happened to find one of these things in a dressing room and bring it out on stage and somebody saw it.
Yeah.
That sometimes there are random events that lead to these, what you would call an emergent property of something. But a lot of sort of systems in life work that way. That's why things are so unpredictable. Why we can't forecast what are our finances actually going to look like in 20 years or something like that.
Sure.
Because there's too many moving parts. And the best we can do is make an estimate and try to be in that ballpark. There's a whole decision-making or assessment idea here. The book you'd want to read is called Risk Savvy. It's by a guy named Gerd Gigerins. He's at the Max Planck Institute in Germany.
Okay.
And what he talks about is the difference between things that are risky and things that are uncertain. This is also, Frank Knight was the economist that talked about this. But the idea is this, that things that involve just plain old risk are things that you can actually predict if you get more data. And the more and more data you get in, you can hone in and predict it. Things that are truly uncertain, you can't really predict them no matter how much data you have. We still live in that kind of world where stuff is going to happen. We're going to have COVID or things like that. And it's interesting that it's actually better to use a rule of thumb in an uncertain arena and be approximately right and not precisely wrong. That it is in a domain where where we're talking about risk. And then actually you do just need more and more data, and then you can make a better and better decision.
Right. Well, I mean, Frank, that ties perfectly into the 4% rule of thumb, right?
Yeah, that's why it actually is a good rule, because that you're not going to do that much better. And I know people like financial calculators and like to keep shoving more numbers into them and re-cranking them and rejiggering them and doing more things with them. But it actually isn't helping you predict that future any better than,
because it's not a data issue. It's an uncertainty.
The rule of 72 and a few other broad data points, because you want to be approximately right. All you're trying to do is get to the ballpark. You're not trying to find your seat in the ballpark. I think people sometimes look at their financial planning as, I need to find the seat in the ballpark. So they are, I need to plan for long-term care. Well, how much planning can you actually do, since you don't know whether you're going to need it or not, or how much you're going to need, or when you're going to need it, or any of those other things?
Right.
You need to be approximately right on that and not precisely wrong, because you don't want to have no resources, but you don't want to be putting the lion's share of your resources to something like that.
Right.
And that is one of the tricky things in financial planning. I think most financial planners don't understand this concept, that actually having more and more data is not going to get you much better of a decision, that just having a few broad pieces of data and applying them well, and then coming up with a nice kind of range of outcomes and not pretending you can get that precise on it. Because the idea is more, when you get to the ballpark, okay, then you'll look around and say, okay, well, I need to go that way. And it's the same thing with financial planning, that, well, when I get 5 years closer, then I'll have a better idea of where my child is going to go to school and how much that's going to cost, or some other thing that's unpredictable now, but will be more predictable later. And then I'll reorient and go that way. But trying to predict it before I have the information, or before I'm actually close to it, is not a useful thing. And in fact, I'll probably be making worse decisions. The harder I try, the worse it gets.
No, that is absolutely fascinating. Of late, I've kind of come to this conclusion that it seems like people in our community are building like every layer of redundancy and conservatism into their planning. And it seems like it's exactly what you're counseling against, right? It's like they're trying to get so specific and granular. And I think what it's costing them is years of their lives. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it is. One of the things I rail about on my podcast is people not spending enough money. I think it should be a 5% rule. If you
tell us more.
If you reorganize your portfolio a little bit and commit to variable withdrawal strategies, that there's no reason this can't be a 5% rule. And it's interesting, the filters people put on, because people don't want to believe this. People that have decided that, no, I want to be really conservative. There's a confirmation bias thing going on here. that people stop looking for any they look for information showing that things are going to be worse in the future. They stop looking for information to show that, oh no, we could actually do better. One of the interesting things I see in that regard is how people look at what Bill Bengen has to say and when he said it. Everybody seems to know that Bill Bengen did this work in the 1990s, came up with this thing called the 4% rule. That was a historical analysis, and he did all these things. If you ask people, well, what does Bill Bengen think today? How many people know the answer to that?
Approximately zero.
Except it's not unknown. He's been on podcasts like Money with Katie.
Interesting.
And what he says is this. He says, if I would have used a better portfolio, you could have a lot better safe withdrawal rate, probably like 4.8, 4.9%.
Okay.
Most people ignore that information. They say, well, Bill Bengen says this. It's like, well, that's what Bill Bengen said in 1994. Right. What does Bill Bengen say in 2021? That's not what he says anymore. And so why is that older Bill Bengen so attractive to you, where the modern new one, you don't like that? That causes you cognitive dissonance because you've been saying, well, I think it's a 4% rule, but I'm going to be 3% just to be conservative and
not count Social Security and pad my expenses
and find other reasons to not spend money. And look for any thread of something that will help you justify that. And this actually has become this is a mimetic thing in the FI community.
Okay.
When I talk about that mimetic desire of people copying things, it's like, you see somebody, well, I have 35 times, I have 40 times. It's like, oh, well, I need to be there too. If you are around people like that who are oversavers and think these things and talk this way, you become that way subconsciously. It's going away from that, but it was almost like this Stanley Thermos fad for a while of people talking about how little they could spend and how low their safe withdrawal rate needed to be. There was a big competition. The bubbles kind of burst. After a while, people was like, yeah, but wait a second. Is that what I
want to live? Well, I mean, Frank, I've tried really hard to change the narrative on that in the last couple of years on spending and living your life. And it can't just be about the money. But yeah, to your point, I think people are looking for it's that this interesting intersection of that pessimism and, like you said, confirmation bias. So, I heard Karsten Big Earn say a 3.25% safe withdrawal is 100% guaranteed or as close as possible. So people just latch onto that. But like I said, most of them, almost everybody is counting Social Security as zero. They're now saying a 3.25% safe withdrawal rate. They are taking their annual expenses and then grossing that up 10 or 20%. So like their safe withdrawal rate is probably approximating 2.5% or something, maybe even lower, right? Like, whereas you're saying there's a real chance if you do this right, hey, maybe 4.8%, maybe 5% might be more plausible.
Yeah. What I would say is no, most of it, we can easily get up to 5% just by thinking this through and really trying.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's do you want to spend money? I mean,
right. Do you want to be a miser forever?
Because for some people, it's like, no, I really don't. It feels bad to me. Now, let me find out reasons to do this. Because I'll tell you that if you have a withdrawal rate that's 3% or less, you really don't need much of a withdrawal strategies to sustain something like that.
Right.
You could have 100% stocks. You could have 30% in stocks. You could have all kinds of things and really not have to think about it at all. And it's funny to me when people have something like that and then they go, okay, and now I need 3 or 4 buckets and I need a CD ladder
and 6 years of cash.
6 years of cash and this bond thing. And it is an example of trying to, if I have more things and more complexity, it makes me feel more secure because it creates an illusion of control.
Right.
And it's like, actually, no, that isn't helping you, but it's making your life any better. But you've already solved the problem by determining you're not going to spend much money.
Right.
That's how you solve the problem. The rest of this it might make you feel good. It might do something psychologically for you, but the way you chose to solve the problem was just by not spending much money.
Right. That resolved all the other problems.
That solved all of this problem, and you don't need to worry about anything else. Now, if you do want to spend more money, then you do have to be more mindful of what you're doing here and how this is going to proceed. because there was a very nice paper, at least the half of it that was about this, by Morningstar that was put out in 2023. You know, they do that annual State of Retirement Now paper.
Yeah.
One year they said 3.3, and the next year they said 3.8. And people
Oh,
there's a problem with their model, and that's why that's jumping around. But the better analysis, the more interesting analysis was they said, all right, well, let's look at all of these variable kind of withdrawal strategies. Let's look at a guardrail strategy. Guyton Klinger is one of them. Michael Kitces has one.
yeah.
And then they look at some very simple things like, well, what if we just don't increase our spending by the CPI rate of inflation? What if we do it by CPI -1, which in fact is what is usual for an average retiree? If you just do that, if you just don't increase your spending, you get between 0.5 and 1 plus on your safe withdrawal rate. So if you just committed to that, you get another 0.5%, at least another 0.5%.
Amazing.
Because remember, the original safe withdrawal rate was predicated on this idea that you're going to start spending this much money on a certain year, and then you are without fail going to increase that by the rate of CPI inflation every single year for the rest of your life.
Right. To the dollar.
Yes, to the dollar. No matter what you actually need to spend, you're going to spend more. And the truth is, people in retirement do not experience CPI inflation. They're not typically not building another family. They're not doing a lot of the things that cause people to experience more inflation, because that's an average. And so if it's an average, there's some people that are below the average and some people are above the average. It's actually not too hard to stay below the average if you're doing things like, well, I'm not going to replace my car every 3 or 4 years. I'm going to replace it every 10 years. I'm not going to consume at the rate that most other people are consuming. And you're probably not doing it anyway if you're a FI person. So the chances are your consumption rate is actually going to be much lower in terms of how it progresses. I can tell you ours has actually gone down nominally. Even with 9% inflation, we're spending less money than we did when I stopped working full time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Mostly because I'm sitting in the house all day long and not driving anywhere and not eating anything anywhere else. I just tell her
that helps.
I'm housebound. I sit here with an old dog and we
record podcasts
and watch YouTube videos. How much could that possibly cost? And that's even, we took a huge expensive trip to Peru this year for our 30th wedding anniversary. It's not like we're not doing the things we want to do. It's just, I'm not going downtown every day and buying lunch every day. Just things like that typically go away. It's funny. I never did any budgeting when I was working because it was sort of like, well, we're going to save first and spend what's left over.
Yeah.
So we just save massive amounts of money, and then I would get a big chunk of it as a bonus, like at the end of the year, and we could just save that or put it away somewhere in one big shot. And then we would usually have money left over at the end anyway. And then we save more of that. And so we never really looked at what we were spending. These days, my wife and I do, because it's sort of like, well, what are we spending? Because it's sort of like, well, where is the money going to come from? And a lot of it is, well, how much money do we actually need to bring out of some account, for next month? So we sit down, at the beginning of the month and say, we have taxes due this month because they're lumpy. We have insurance due this month. We have some other thing that we need to bring more money out for. But as we've gone through and monitored it, our spending is flat to going down nominally.
Incredible.
I mean, that's not even so. If it continued on that rate, I could add another 1 to 1.5% onto a safe withdrawal rate. And that's the other thing. Once you actually get to retirement, your spending is so variable and flexible that it does not conform to any of these sort of boxes where it's like you're going to actually spend this percentage this month of this thing. It's going to be a lot more, or a lot less, and there'll be other factors that go into that. I mean, one of the reasons that I started my podcast was simply assuming you want to spend as much money as you can out of your invested assets. How much is that realistically, and how can we make it more by holding different things and by managing it in a different way than would be typical? So, I just had a podcast where I said, everybody should be able to spend 5% without really working too hard at it. We use what I call a 3-1-1 plan in terms of spending. And what that is 3% is for what I call keep the lights on expenses, that the stuff we have to spend money on, our taxes, our food, our utilities, our healthcare, all of those things that aren't going to go away. You kind of know what they are and you just put the money away. So 3% is on that. 1% is on what I would call comfort expenses. That is hiring people to, clean your house or your lawn, your gym membership, going out to eat, all of the things that are just kind of fun to do that you do all the time, or that, if I had to cut this back, I would, but I really don't want to. And it's part of my habitual life. And then another 1%, I would say, goes on what I call extravagances, which are, okay, let's go to Peru and spend a lot of money there. The next ones we're going to spend on some renovations in the house, and we're just kind of plotting those things out. But those are sort of like, they're usually like one-off big trips or big expenses, but they're not the same like every year. And they're the kind of thing where you could say, yeah, I'm not going to take a big trip this year. I'm not going to do a renovation this year. There's nothing there that has to be done for those. And to me, that is a conservative spending plan that gets us to that 5%. Because I think we can actually spend more if we have to, if we want to. And maybe we will as time goes on, because if our assets do grow, we will spend more money and we will give it away. Charity is important to us as well.
For sure.
I'm on the board of a charity and they want my money.
Generally how it works.
That's part of what gets you on the board of a charity.
Yeah, that is very true.
I'm also the treasurer, so I get to count the money.
I'm the treasurer of my girls' swim team. So yeah, I know how that works. Believe me.
Yes. So that is, a basic discussion of that, but it is designed around flexibility. And for me, 3% is a bare minimum spending.
Got it.
That in no way, shape, or form should that be your goal. Because you're going to die at your highest net worth. That is what economists would call your revealed preference.
Okay.
And I like to think about this idea too. What economists have always said is that, well, you can't trust what people actually say, because they say they're going to do something, then they do something that's completely opposite to that or does not coordinate with that. So what they've come up with is this idea of a revealed preference. It's like, we don't care what you say you think you're going to do. We just look at what you actually did or are doing and look at the most probable outcome of that and say, that is what you actually are trying to do. That is your revealed preference. We're looking for an objective way to do this without actually going into somebody's brain and asking them. We look at the behavior, look at the most probable outcome and say, well, if that's your most probable outcome and that's what you're doing, and we're assuming you're a very rational person, then you are intending to get that outcome. And that's called your revealed preference. So in this context, if your behavior is spending 3% or less of your portfolio, your revealed preference is to die at your highest net worth, because that's your amazing. Most likely outcome. You tell people things like this, like, well, I don't want to be. No, that's not what I meant. That's not.
That is amazing. That is absolutely fascinating.
But I always think about that when people are talking about, well, I'm going to do this, this, and this. It's like, well, all right, you're going to do this. Let's just think about what's the most likely outcome of that if you drank a liter of vodka every day.
Gonna have some liver issues.
Your revealed preference is dying of alcoholism or liver disease.
Yeah.
But you can do that with any sort of thing. And I think what that gives you is an objective standard for judging what people are doing, because otherwise this devolves down into, well, personal finance is personal. I can do whatever I want with my money.
Your favorite thing, right?
My retort is, personal finance is finance. Finance is the noun. Personal is the adjective. The noun controls the adjective. So I think that is a better starting point for a discussion with people about their finances than asking them what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes what they're trying to do, or what they say they are trying to do, is inconsistent with what they're actually doing. And what they're actually doing is, maybe governed by fears or beliefs or some other thing that's not even attached to preferences. Could be habits or things like that. So, you can reverse that and go the other way. A lot of people in our society spend too much money on their children and their adult children, and they support them long after they should be supporting them to their own detriment. And that is one of the, other than like health issues or addictions or things like that, that is one of the key reasons that people end up broke when they're older. And so you would say that somebody who is overfunding their children to their own detriment actually has a revealed preference to be bankrupt in their old age, because that is the most likely. Now, that's not what they want.
Right. Not consciously.
That's not what they want. But objectively, an economist would say, well, that's a revealed preference. And it's because they value giving this money to their kids so much that going bankrupt in their old age is fine with them. That's the weirdness you always get into with economists, is that they assume everybody's a rational actor, even when we know they're not. But this analysis is an interesting place always, I think, to start. And it's sort of like, well, if you don't want that to be your revealed preference, then maybe you should change your behaviors in some way.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Frank. So, revealed preferences. So it's funny because you said that's a good place to start. I feel like that's a good place for us to close this episode.
Yeah.
And I suspect very strongly. So, we didn't get to any of the mailbag questions, but,
which I apologize for. I did prepare answers to all of the ones you gave me, but we can do this.
This has been absolutely amazing. I mean, I could not have anticipated that the conversation would go this way. And that's what's so beautiful about podcasting, right? I think that is the perfect kind of launching point for people to really, really think about their own personal finances. How many layers of this conservatism are they layering upon, again, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer? And you're saying, hey, there's a reasonable chance 5% might be too conservative in many cases. And yeah, I think we are definitely going to have to do at least one follow-up, Frank. So we'll do the mailbag. And I strongly suspect people are going to really want to dive into the granular look at that 5%. So let's put a pin in that right there, because this has been amazing. And I just want to thank you again for everything you do for the community, for everything you've done for us over the years. And we've mentioned your podcast multiple times, Risk Parity Radio. Anywhere else people can find you other than the Facebook group and the podcast?
That's it. And by the Facebook group, it is the ChooseFI Facebook group. There's a couple other ones.
You're active in a lot of groups.
Catching Up to Fi is Bill and Becky and now Jackie's podcast. Yeah. And in their Facebook group, they have a Ask Uncle Frank a finance question on Thursdays. And so if you do want to ask a question directly to me about something in a forum, that's probably the easiest way to do it. Other than that, most of my podcast these days is responding to people's emails in addition to talk about portfolio construction issues. Perfect. We are up to podcast number 334. So I've been doing this since, I guess, July of 2020. A lot of the early ones go through sort of the background and the nuts and bolts, and everything is built on those early ones. It's 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 are the first 5 episodes that you want to listen to that. And we do talk about that because my podcast, I liken it to going to a dive bar. And if you go into a dive bar, there's a whole bunch of regulars sitting around and they're talking about stuff, and you're in the middle of a conversation. You have no idea what they're talking about. And so it's a little bit of a weird place.
Hard to jump in. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9.
1, 3, 5, 7, 9 would be sort of a background for the podcast.
Awesome.
But it's a very enjoyable experience for me, and I really appreciate my listeners and being able to get on here with the nicest guy of Phi.
Okay.
Brad Barrett, the nicest guy of Phi.
That's going to stick, Frank. Oh, no. All right, my friend. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
You're quite welcome, and hopefully I'll see you in the flesh at some point in the future if you're not on a roller coaster somewhere.
Yep. Lots of coasters. All right, Frank. Until next time.